Welcome to the research project, History. In this video, we're going to be providing a summary of E.H.Carr's What is History? Edward Hallett Carr was a British political scientist and historian, specialising in modern Russian history. He was born in 1892 and lived until 1982. His book, What is History?, was based on a series of lectures he gave in 1961. Although controversial at the time, this work remains an important piece in our understanding of the nature of history and our study of it. In Chapter 1, The Historian and His Facts, Carr notes that the historian is engaged on a continuous process of moulding his facts to his interpretation and his interpretation to his facts. It is impossible to assign primacy to one over the other. In this way, Carr is noting that history is not the mere accumulation and retelling of dry facts. Rather, the historian gathers the facts and selects from them the relevant ones and combines them in order to create meaning. In looking at facts, he is clear to distinguish between what he terms facts of the past and historical facts. In his view, a fact of the past only becomes a historical fact when it has significance to the events and meaning in history. He summarises this opening position by making 3 points. Firstly, history is not pure. Rather, it is the recreation of the past through the selection of facts combined with the mind and imagination of the historian. Therefore, there is a need when reading history to understand the mind and perspective of the historian. And I quote, "In the first place, the facts of history never come to us pure, since they do not and cannot exist in pure form. They are always refracted through the mind of the recorder. It follows that when we take up the work of history, our first concern should be not with the facts which it contains, but the historian who wrote it." His second point is that there is a need for an imaginative understanding of the people the historian is reconstituting in his mind. History cannot be written unless the historian can achieve some kind of contact with the mind of those about whom he is writing. And thirdly, he states that we are only able to view the past from our own perspective. Historians are not godlike figures who stand apart from history and view it with perfect impartiality. Rather, they are products of the age and society and interests in which they live. He concludes the chapter by answering the question asked in it: what is history? My first answer, therefore, to the question, what is history, is that it is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. In Chapter 2, Society and the Individual, Carr asserts that the role of the historian is a social one. The questions asked, the evidence searched for, is shaped and guided by the society that have shaped the historian. In the same way, the facts of the past that have been recorded and retained have been done so by individuals moulded by the society and culture of their time and location. Historians like to be able to interact with individuals. However, it is impossible to accurately interact with a person without understanding their culture. Because of the impact of society and the environment, the idea that great individuals are the driving force in history, the so-called great man theory, has less of an impact than we may think. The so-called great men of history were only able to make the decisions and choices that were available to them. Because of this, the nameless millions who create that society and environment arguably have more of an impact on the shape and direction of history than those who were recorded as having driven it. Even if we take an extreme example of those who seek to rebel against the society that they live in, are only able to rebel against the society that exists. Therefore, they too are equally shaped by their society. He concludes the chapter emphasising the social role of the historian. Quote, "History then, in both senses of the word, meaning both inquiry conducted by the historian and the facts of the past into which she inquires, is a social process, in which individuals are engaged as social beings, and the imaginary antithesis between society and the individual is no more than a red herring drawn across our path to confuse our thinking. The reciprocal process of interaction between the historian and his facts, what I have called the dialogue between the present and the past, is a dialogue not between abstract and isolated individuals, but between the society of today and the society of yesterday. History, in Burckhardt's words, is the record of what one age finds worthy of note in another. The past is intelligible to us only in the light of the present, and we can fully understand the present only in the light of the past. To enable man to understand the society of the present and to increase his mastery over society of the present is the dual function of history." In Chapter 3, History, Science and Morality, Carr's attention is turned to the nature of historical discovery and defends the field from accusations that it is unscientific. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the common scientific method was to look for laws of nature, such as Newton's laws of motion and the laws of gravity, while those studying the newly created social sciences also looked for laws. For example, economist Adam Smith's laws of the markets, among others. However, in the late 19th century, there was a move from looking for laws to testing hypotheses. It was assumed by many that the study of history would not be able to be categorised as scientific, due to the difficulty of testing hypotheses in the field. Carr notes 5 common objections to classifying history as part of the social sciences, and argues against them. The first objection is that history deals with the unique, science with the general. This theory dates back to the times of Aristotle, who made the point that poetry is more philosophical and serious than history, as poetry had general truth, while history only dealt with specifics. However, Carr argues that this is true of most of science. Most of science deals with generalizations. As an example, no two animals are perfectly identical, and yet we are more than happy to make generalizations about various species and to put them in scientific categories. As well as this, anything that requires language to describe it will by nature have inherent generalizations in it. For example, World War II and the Peloponnesian War were vastly different events, and yet we classify both as wars. Just because a specific historic event only occurred once and in one place, that doesn't mean it can't inform our understanding of similar types of events in different times and in different places. The second objection is that history teaches no lessons. Those who reject the idea that you can learn from history are likely to be the same as those who reject the generalizations of history. However, it is clearly evident that lessons are taken from history. And also, our learning from history is one way we understand the present, that it is lit by our understanding of the past. The third objection is that history cannot predict. Carr argues that this is much the same as for what we might call the hard sciences. While the law of gravity will predict an apple falling from the tree will go towards the ground, it cannot predict which apple will fall, and when and where exactly it will land. He uses the example of a measles outbreak in a school. If 3 children in a school test positive for measles, we can know from history, from times in the past when children have been at school with measles, it is almost certain that there will be a measles outbreak. What we will not know is which children specifically will catch it. With science, as with history, there is accident and chaos that prevents perfect predictions. The fourth objection is that history is subjective, as man is examining himself. Carr admits that this argument makes a more cogent point than the previous ones, because man is studying himself. Both he and the conclusions he comes to about the object of the study will be affected. In an extreme example, if a prominent economist, as a recognised social scientist, predicts a boom or crash in the economy, their prediction may have a causal relationship with the outcome. Their prediction may cause the crash. The fifth objection Carr recognises is that as history deals with morality and religion, it must be separate from science. Carr first deals briefly with the relationship between religion and history, concluding that while a historian may privately hold belief in a deity, in the constructing of a technical history, the reliance on or belief in God is not likely to be accepted. Meanwhile, he views the relationship of history and morality as much more complicated. It is his view that passing judgment on the personal lives of individuals is of little interest, noting that if their actions in their personal lives do not impact on history, there's of little use in us judging them, as they were a product of their environment and their society. He argues rather that it is the historian's role to judge institutions and historical trends. Using the example of slavery, he points out that we can easily condemn the institution and practice of slavery, while taking a more nuanced view on individual slave owners. There is, however, another issue with condemning historical practices and events, as many of these have led to progress and benefit down the track. Importantly, those who bear the cost in history are rarely the ones who reap the reward. For example, the children who were exploited in the Industrial Revolution did not get the benefits of the modern world. Yet, many view the Industrial Revolution as a time and process of progress. He concludes that there is no good reason to separate history from the sciences. They are all systems of knowledge. He does note that history should take its position in the sciences and improve its standards by making it more scientific. In Carr's view, the more sociologists understand history and historians understand the social sciences, the better it will be for both fields. I quote, "The presuppositions and the methods of the physicist, the geologist, and the psychologist and the historian differ widely in detail. Nor do I wish to commit myself to the proposition that in order to be more scientific, the historian must follow more closely the methods of physical science. But the historian and physical scientist are united in the fundamental purpose of seeking to explain, and in the fundamental procedure of question and answer. The historian, like any other scientist, is an animal who incessantly asks the question, why?" In Chapter 4, Causation in History, Carr asserts that the fundamental role of the historian is to investigate and establish the causes of historical events. Quote, "The study of history is the study of causes. The historian, as I said at the end of my last lecture, continuously asks the question, why? And so long as he hopes for an answer, he cannot rest. The great historian, or perhaps I should say more broadly, the great thinker, is the man who asks the question why, about new things, or in what contexts." Carr is not alone in considering the question of causation as being the fundamental question for the historian. He notes that historians all the way back to Herodotus have asked the same question. The first problem with identifying the cause of historical events is that in almost every case there is more than one cause. Therefore, the historian needs to identify multiple causes. However, when the historian recognises that there are many causes to the events he is studying, he then needs to prioritise them in order of their significance. Every historical argument revolves around the question of the priority of causes. In this way, It is the role of the historian both to identify the multiplicity of causes and then somewhat contradictorily simplify them down to the main ones. He then analyses two schools of thought around causation in history. Firstly, determinism, and then the chaos or chance view. He defines determinism in this way. Older, fine, I hope, and controversially, is the belief that everything happens has a cause or causes, and could not have happened differently unless something in the cause or causes had also been different. He takes it to be true that we assume determinism in everyday life, and unless we assumed that normal human behaviour was determined by causes, which are in theory understandable, we would have great difficulty in interacting with those around us. He notes that it is the same for the historian. Historians, like normal everyday people viewing normal everyday actions, should consider that human actions have causes, and the study of history would be impossible if we did not believe this to be the case. However, he points out that this does not mean that historical events are inevitable. In almost every case, other courses of actions and choices were available to the people who were driving the historical events. He then turns to the chaos theory of history. This theory of history he defines as, this is the theory that history is, by and large, a chapter of accidents, a series of events determined by chance coincidences and attributable only to the most casual causes. He uses the example that some have argued that Cleopatra's beauty and Julius Caesar's and subsequently Mark Antony's infatuation with her is merely a chance occurrence. However, he notes that to suggest that there is no causal link between Mark Antony's infatuation and actions and Cleopatra's beauty is somewhat ludicrous. There are many instances of men making poor decisions based on their infatuation with a beautiful woman. He concludes the chapter by arguing that it is clear that there are both determined and accidental causes in history, but as historians we need to distinguish between rational and accidental causes. Rational causes are more likely to be applicable to a number of places, times, and events, whereas accidental causes are less likely to be instructive in our judgments on other events, although it is likely that an event where the cause seems accidental, there are broader causes which have allowed that event or decision to take place. In Chapter 5, Carr deals with the idea of history as progress. The central hypothesis of many historians is that history is a story of progress. This has not always been the case. Those in ancient Asia, Greece, and Rome were generally not interested in the future or the past. It was the rise of Jewish and Christian thought that added a new element to history. They had the view that history had an endpoint, to which it was progressing. This view carried over into the medieval period, and only ended with the Renaissance, with a return to the view that from our perspective, history is without beginning or end. He notes that because history is no longer viewed as having an end, there are some, especially in his day, who instead of speaking about progress talked about decline, especially the decline of the West. However, most historians still tend to think of history as progressing. In the next part of this chapter, he examined 4 ideas about what is progress in history and what it is not. Firstly, some have taken the ideas of Darwinism and evolution to be a basis for progress in history. While Carr does not dispute this, he notes that the time frame involved in evolution is too long, that no real change can have occurred during the period which we consider historical events to have occurred in. Secondly, he considers the idea of progress without a finite beginning or end. Carr notes that we do not need to conceive of progress as having a finite or defined beginning or end. Particularly, there is no good historical reason to consider any point as the end or high point of history or civilization. His third point is that no sane person ever believed in a kind of progress which advanced in an unbroken straight line, without reverses or deviations or breaks in continuity. So even the sharpest reverse in progress is not necessarily favourable to the belief that history is progressing. It is evident, he argues, that history and progress are not laid out in an unbroken straight line. Rather, what progress there is in history is uneven and comes and goes in different places and different times. Lastly, he looks at what he terms the essential content of progress in terms of historical action. The way he sees it, individual action for the benefit of society is not necessarily seen as progress by those who are undertaking it. Rather, it is the historian who applies a hypothesis of progress to these actions. He presupposes that man is capable of profiting from his ancestors by acquiring assets, either material or through knowledge. However, the accumulation of assets and knowledge does not necessarily lead to progress in a social level. From his viewpoint, in the 1960s, the world had gone through 2 world wars, and although technology had advanced, can that truly be considered progress on a human level? He then turned his attention to the idea of objectivity in history. He hypothesises that history cannot be truly objective, as the facts of the past only become facts of history because a historian has attached significance to them. This does not mean that he takes on a perfectly relativistic view that one interpretation is as good as another. In his view, the ideal historian should seek to be objective, despite knowing that he will never achieve it. Quote, "What, then, do you mean when we appraise a historian for being objective, or to say that one historian is more objective than another? Not, it is clear, simply that he gets his facts right, but rather that he chooses the right facts, or, in other words, that he applies the right standard of significance. When we call a historian objective, we mean, I think, 2 things. First of all, we mean that he has a capacity to rise above the limited vision of his own situation in society and in history." He goes on to say, secondly, we mean that he has the capacity to project his vision into the future in such a way as to give him a more profound and more lasting insight into the past than can be attained by those historians whose outlook is entirely bound by their own immediate situation. He finishes the chapter by considering facts and values. Our values will have a significant impact on how we judge the progress or otherwise of historical events. He notes that although in our historical inquiry we may seek to find as objective facts as we can, the questions we ask and the answers we seek will be moulded by our values. In his view, the objective historian is the one who considers and tries to deeply understand the reciprocal process and the interrelationship between facts and values, ultimately approaching something that might ordinarily be considered the truth. In the final chapter, The Widening Horizon, Carr looks at the world as it is in the middle years of the 20th century, and looks to understand the role of the historian in understanding the world as it is, and also what might lie ahead in the future. He notes that the period in which he is writing and speaking about is a period of change, arguably greater than anything that has come before, both as a result of scientific discoveries, but also social and industrial revolutions. In his view, the modern age is one where people generally are more conscious of their place and role in history, and because of this are trying more than previously to change what the future may be. He notes that modern countries from France to America, as well as thinkers like Karl Marx, have consciously tried to establish modern nations based on some degree of rationality, and that in these nations, man would become fully conscious of their power over the environment and his ability to make laws by which his society will live. In this way, society is at least theoretically based on reason rather than tradition. However, he recognises that from his position in history, the middle years of the 20th century, this change has not yet fully taken place, and may never fully take place. He concludes the chapter and the book by considering the nature of change. In the 19th century, change seemed to come about by revolution, as there were efforts to have a wholesale change and upend the status quo. In his view, Carr saw that the appetite and desire for wholesale change had slowed by the midpoint of the 20th century. Rather, people were seeking gradual change with practical solutions to real problems, rather than a reimagining of the philosophical basis of the nation-state. He saw this as a challenge, and looked to a time when people would regain their boldness for wholesale change. Quote, "Progress in human affairs, whether in science or in history or in society, has come mainly through the bold readiness of human beings not to confine themselves to seeking piecemeal improvements in the way things are done, but to present fundamental challenges in the name of reason to the current way of doing things, and to be about all hidden assumptions on which it rests. I look forward to a time when the historians and sociologists and political thinkers of the English-speaking world will regain their courage for that task." He ends by declaring himself an optimist, that whatever the challenges, the human story was and is worth observing. "I shall look out on a world in tumult, and a world in travail, and she'll answer in the well-worn words of the great scientist, and yet it moves." Thanks for watching. Please consider liking, commenting and subscribing to help the channel grow. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.